West Africa is on edge. A threat has been issued. War is now a possibility, not with foreign invaders, but between neighbors. ECOWAS has drawn a red line. The Sahel Alliance refuses to step back. What began as quiet political disagreement is now spiraling into something far more dangerous. This is no longer diplomacy. It's a collision between power and principle. It was supposed to be just another summit. Dull, diplomatic, symbolic. A few press releases, empty pledges about trade and peacekeeping, and a carefully rehearsed speech on unity. But instead, ECOWAS emerged from its headquarters with something West Africa hadn't seen in decades: the threat of military intervention against its own members. The targets were clear, even if names weren't mentioned. The alliance of Sahel states, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, had become the new object of confrontation. And ECOWAS, under new leadership and facing immense pressure from its international partners, had declared its intention to restore constitutional order in the region by force if necessary. Behind the diplomatic language were ultimatums: transition to civilian rule immediately, reinstate elections, return to the fold. No discussion, no negotiation. And if ignored, consequences would follow. Though vague, the tone was unmistakable. ECOWAS was preparing for war. But in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, the response was not panic. It was resolve. A new declaration from the Sahel Alliance responded clearly. Any military intervention against one member would be treated as an attack against all three. Their mutual defense pact, signed in 2023, was no longer symbolic. It was a line in the sand. This wasn't just posturing, it was a historic shift in regional dynamics. For the first time in ECOWAS history, member states were not merely disagreeing, they were actively resisting. And not from the fringes, but from within. The Sahel Trio didn't simply withdraw from ECOWAS to protest policy. They withdrew to build something new, something sovereign, something uncompromising. To many outside observers, this looked reckless. Three military-led governments choosing defiance over dialogue. But to millions across the Sahel, it looked like something else entirely. Finally, someone was standing up to a system that had long stopped working. The Alliance of Sahel States saw ECOWAS not as a neutral arbiter, but as a compromised gatekeeper. One that responded slowly to real threats like terrorism, but swiftly to any disruption of the status quo. One that ignored constitutional manipulation by entrenched leaders in some countries, but punished military transitions in others. To them, ECOWAS had lost its legitimacy not recently, but over years of bureaucratic delay, elite protectionism, and foreign entanglements. They believed the bloc no longer served African people. It served African power. And now that power was being challenged in a way the region had never witnessed before. But ECOWAS too was cornered. With Western backers, France, the US, the EU, all urging intervention, the bloc had to act or lose relevance, especially after being forced out militarily from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Western influence now rested squarely on ECOWAS' shoulders. If the bloc failed to rein in these breakaway states, the old order risked collapsing, and not just diplomatically but ideologically. Because if these three could break free and build alternatives, others might follow. Ghana, Senegal, even Nigeria could begin questioning the legitimacy of ECOWAS mandates. This wasn't just a regional feud, it was a battle for the soul of post-colonial Africa. And now both sides had drawn their lines. ECOWAS had its mandates. The Sahel had its defenses. And between them stood the people, uncertain, anxious, but increasingly vocal. In the streets of Bamako and Ouagadougou, young protesters held signs that read, "We choose sovereignty." They didn't want war, but they didn't want control either. And now the question echoing across the region was this: is ECOWAS willing to risk everything to preserve a system many no longer believe in? Long before the Sahel states walked away from ECOWAS, the cracks in the system were already showing. They didn't appear overnight. They widened slowly through years of broken promises, unanswered calls for help, and an overwhelming sense that the people of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger were being left to survive on their own. It began in the early 2000s when jihadist insurgencies swept through rural regions, consuming entire provinces in chaos. Villages vanished, schools closed, state institutions crumbled. Mali pleaded for coordination. Burkina Faso requested joint action. Niger demanded resources. And ECOWAS? It hesitated. Meetings were held. Reports were drafted. But while the paperwork moved, people died. What little support arrived was piecemeal, conditional, and often too late. Troops were sent only after the damage was irreversible. Weapons came with caveats. Funding was tied to bureaucratic hurdles. Every step forward required external approval. And behind all this slowness stood the shadow of Western influence. Foreign governments pulling levers behind regional responses, using aid as leverage and diplomacy as delay. As years passed, frustrations grew deeper. ECOWAS, once envisioned as a vehicle for unity, began to resemble something else entirely, a club for incumbents. Across the region, presidents extended their rule through constitutional amendments, third-term bids, and manipulated elections. In countries like Côte d'Ivoire and Togo, leaders pushed through controversial mandates with minimal resistance. ECOWAS responded with mild disapproval. Never sanctions, never force, never urgency. But when junior officers in Mali or Burkina Faso stepped in, claiming to fill a void left by corrupt and paralyzed civilian governments, they were met with instant punishment, sanctions, suspension, isolation. The contrast was impossible to ignore. For ordinary citizens watching this unfold, the message became clear. ECOWAS didn't protect democracy. It protected those who wore its colors. That realization turned disillusionment into anger, and that anger slowly transformed into defiance. By the time the pandemic arrived, the region was already boiling. Lockdowns shattered informal economies. Food insecurity skyrocketed. Youth unemployment soared. Corruption scandals mounted. And in the middle of this misery, ECOWAS leadership still gathered in five-star hotels, issuing statements that rang hollow across starving communities. In places like Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou, the disconnect was unbearable. People didn't just feel ignored, they felt mocked. As the economy collapsed, ECOWAS became a symbol of failure, aloof, remote, foreign-aligned. Its officials seemed more concerned with donor meetings than defending borders, more eager to lecture than to listen. And then, the dominoes began to fall. In 2020, Mali fell to a coup. In 2022, Burkina Faso followed, then Niger. Each time ECOWAS responded predictably, freeze their assets, suspend their membership, issue ultimatums. But with each attempt to isolate, the trio grew closer. They coordinated responses, launched joint operations, and listened to their citizens. For the first time in decades, people in the Sahel heard leaders speak of sovereignty not as theory, but as policy. It didn't matter whether it was in uniforms or suits. What mattered was that someone was finally answering their cries. By 2023, the Alliance of Sahel States was born, not just as a security pact, but as an ideological declaration, a rejection of dependency, a refusal to be managed. And when ECOWAS demanded that these nations return to the fold, adopt rushed transitions, and surrender their autonomy, the response was unified and unforgiving. We are not children, one Burkinabe official declared. We will not be scolded or instructed. We are building our own architecture. And so the rupture became permanent. ECOWAS had spent decades managing conflict through delay and diplomacy, but it had never faced a rejection this total, this prepared, this grounded in shared pain. The Sahel wasn't just breaking away, it was building something to replace the old. Something that, for the first time, made the people feel like they had a stake in what came next. The creation of the Alliance of Sahel States was more than a political maneuver. It was a line drawn through history, etched with defiance, pain, and a burning desire for self-determination. It didn't emerge from boardrooms or foreign conferences. It was born from dust, desperation, and a collective realization that waiting for salvation had cost too much. By mid-2023, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were no longer operating in isolation. Intelligence was shared in real time. Joint military drills were held. Cross-border task forces were created to address everything from terrorism to smuggling. But beneath the security cooperation was something deeper, a shared identity forged not by ethnicity or language, but by a common betrayal. These nations had all watched their citizens suffer while their supposed regional guardians issued promises instead of protection. Now they were finished waiting. The AES did not frame itself as a rebellion. It framed itself as a reset. In speeches, leaders spoke not of war, but of rebuilding, not of revenge, but of responsibility. They didn't apologize for their uniforms. They stood behind them, because in their eyes it wasn't about coups, it was about reclaiming control from a system that had long abandoned the grassroots. They were criticized by foreign observers, accused of authoritarianism and populism. But in their capitals, the streets told a different story. Crowds gathered, waving flags not in fear, but in pride. Songs were written, markets named after new roads and clinics that hadn't existed a year prior. Something was moving, and ECOWAS could feel it. The bloc, long accustomed to top-down diplomacy, now faced a challenge it couldn't simply sanction away. The AES was not just standing still, it was gaining momentum. Internally, ECOWAS was fracturing. Nigeria, once its unshakable pillar, was consumed by economic crisis. Ghana struggled under crushing debt. Senegal faced protests of its own. The louder ECOWAS tried to speak, the more disjointed it sounded. Meanwhile, the Sahel Alliance was speaking with one voice, and that voice, above all, was coming from Ouagadougou. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had become more than Burkina Faso's head of state. He was now the symbolic anchor of the movement. Young, articulate, and unyielding, he didn't couch his statements in diplomatic pleasantries. He spoke of Africa's stolen wealth, of corrupted independence, of a generation tired of asking. His speeches circulated far beyond his borders, in the alleys of Dakar, in the campuses of Nairobi, in WhatsApp groups from Soweto to Casablanca. His words were shared not as propaganda, but as prophecy. "We are not seeking permission," he declared. "We are reclaiming what was always ours." That message resonated because it wasn't theoretical. Under Traoré, Burkina Faso had begun redirecting mining revenues into domestic infrastructure. Gold that once enriched foreign companies now funded clinics and roads. Military units were restructured to defend villages first, not just chase enemies through the desert. Programs were launched for youth training, agriculture revitalization, and digital infrastructure. These weren't promises. They were visible, tangible, and above all, local. And that made them dangerous, because results born from independence undermine the very foundation of the dependency model ECOWAS was built to manage. If the AES could show progress without debt, stability without foreign oversight, and unity without the traditional institutions, then the legitimacy of those institutions would wither. That's why ECOWAS began escalating, not through open warfare, but through threats, travel bans, funding freezes, and policy statements laced with urgency. And behind those statements loomed foreign influence, France, the EU, and the United States, watching nervously as their regional partners lost grip. For them, this wasn't just about Burkina Faso or Mali. It was about the possibility that their model of partnership, aid in exchange for control, was no longer being accepted. In private, diplomats spoke of containing the contagion. In public, they called for restoring democratic norms. But on the ground, people weren't asking for elections. They were asking for sovereignty. And the AES, for all its faults, was giving them that, on their terms, in their voices, and under their flags. The threat of conflict loomed larger each day. But the war, if it came, would not be between armies alone. It would be between two visions of Africa, one still waiting and one already building. With every passing week, the standoff between ECOWAS and the Sahel Alliance grew more dangerous. Statements turned into threats, and threats began to look like war plans. ECOWAS, under intense pressure from Western allies, especially France and the United States, started hinting at a possible activation of its standby military force, a regional intervention mechanism originally designed for peacekeeping, now being positioned as a tool of enforcement. Though no country was named explicitly, the intent was unmistakable. The target was the alliance of Sahel states. But in response, something even more alarming happened. The Sahel states didn't retreat. They didn't even flinch. Instead, they escalated. In a unified declaration, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger reminded the world of their mutual defense pact. An attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. This wasn't rhetorical posturing. It was a military reality backed by coordinated troop movements, joint command structures, and shared intelligence. The alliance had spent the past year not just talking about sovereignty, but preparing to defend it. Analysts around the world began ringing alarms. A misstep, a miscalculation, or a single clash on the wrong border could ignite the region's most severe internal conflict in decades. But to the leaders of AES, the choice was already made. They believed that bending now meant betraying everything their people had endured. To them, the threat of war was no more terrifying than the slow death of foreign-managed peace. In Niamey, citizens marched in support of the government's stance, holding banners that read, "If this is war, we've already been in it." In Bamako, war veterans joined young civilians in neighborhood security patrols, preparing not just for invasion, but for resistance. In Ouagadougou, Traoré delivered a televised address that shook the region. "We have been invaded before," he said, "not always with weapons, but with policies, contracts, and smiles. This time we will not surrender quietly." His words weren't just heard, they were felt, and not just in the Sahel. Across West Africa, citizens of ECOWAS member states began asking uncomfortable questions. Why had their own governments remained silent during years of Sahelian suffering? Why was the bloc more aggressive in confronting military governments than it was in confronting poverty, terrorism, or corruption? And why, suddenly, was the use of military force back on the table, not for peacekeeping, but for restoring a status quo many believed had already collapsed? These questions found little response from ECOWAS officials, who were now caught in a trap of their own making. On one side, they risked total irrelevance if the AES continued to defy them without consequence. On the other, they faced regional disaster if they pursued war against three allied nations with growing domestic support. Behind closed doors, member states grew nervous. Nigeria, the bloc's largest power, was entangled in its own economic turmoil. Ghana faced rising unrest over austerity measures. Senegal's leadership was under fire from opposition movements. None of them were eager to send troops into a volatile conflict with no guarantee of success and every possibility of blowback. Still, ECOWAS had little choice but to maintain pressure. To do otherwise would be to admit that it had lost control, not just of three member states, but of its own authority. In public, it called for a return to civilian rule, the resumption of elections, and the reintegration of the Sahel into its fold. But in private, many officials knew those demands would not be met. The AES was not interested in delay. It was interested in departure. And with every day that passed without reconciliation, the two sides drifted further apart, not as temporary rivals, but as two competing futures for West Africa. One built on inherited institutions, international approval, and managed democracy. The other built on defiance, risk, and the raw will to start again. The longer the standoff lasted, the more it became clear. This was not just a test of diplomacy, it was a contest of legitimacy. And only one vision would survive. By the time ECOWAS had fully realized the scale of the rebellion it was facing, the Sahel Alliance had already cemented its foundations. What seemed like a short-term political rupture was now a fully formed geopolitical pivot. The Alliance of Sahel States was holding security summits, announcing joint infrastructure projects, and even discussing a regional currency. What shocked many international observers wasn't the boldness, it was the speed. Within months, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had redrawn the map of West African cooperation without ECOWAS. And in doing so, they attracted not just criticism, but interest. Delegations from Russia, China, Turkey, and Iran began arriving in Sahelian capitals. Offers were made, not in the language of charity or governance reform, but in terms of sovereignty, trade, and mutual defense. Energy partnerships, arms deals, infrastructure investments, all were negotiated with new partners who didn't demand elections or compliance with Western terms. This shift triggered a panic in foreign capitals. For decades, West Africa had been a reliable theater for Western influence. Military bases, donor-funded programs, mineral contracts, and political training academies. Now that entire framework was being threatened not by an external invasion, but by a refusal. The Sahel wasn't rising with foreign support, it was rising without it. And that, to many in Washington, Paris, and Brussels, was unacceptable. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted on ECOWAS to act. Western officials didn't issue direct military orders, but funding, trade access, and diplomatic standing were quietly placed on the table. ECOWAS leaders knew that inaction could cost them international prestige, but action could earn them everything else. Still, the pressure worked. The rhetoric hardened, new sanctions were proposed, travel bans expanded, rumors began swirling about covert operations and destabilization plans. Yet the Sahel states didn't show weakness. Instead, they hardened their own positions. Security drills increased. Defensive fortifications were constructed near border zones. Surveillance systems, aided by new technology from non-Western allies, were deployed. The AES states weren't simply waiting to be attacked. They were preparing to endure and outlast. In speeches, Ibrahim Traoré began speaking less like a national leader and more like a revolutionary commander. He no longer referred to Burkina Faso's place in ECOWAS. He referred to Burkina Faso's place in African history. "We are the fire of the generation that waited too long," he declared in one rally. "We are not against Africa, we are against its capture." The audience didn't just cheer, they cried, because for many across the Sahel, this wasn't rhetoric. It was the echo of lives spent waiting for change that never came. Roads left unbuilt, children left uneducated, fields left untilled while meetings took place in distant hotels under the banners of progress. Now, at last, something real was being done, and that reality had become dangerous. Western media outlets began running stories questioning Traoré's motives. Was he power-hungry? Was he leading his nation into war? Why was he embracing foreign powers once seen as adversaries? But the people didn't ask those questions. They asked why it had taken so long for anyone to act. In marketplaces and mosques, in homes and schools, a shift in consciousness was unfolding. The language of liberation had returned. Not the old slogans of panafricanism alone, but something more urgent, more grounded. The right to exist without being monitored. The right to build without being managed. The right to choose allies without asking for permission. This awakening, perhaps more than any road, any speech, or any border, was what frightened ECOWAS the most, because the institutions that once brokered power through fear and favor were now facing a generation that feared nothing more than going back. The Sahel states had drawn their line, the world had noticed, and though the tanks had not yet rolled, the war of visions had already begun. While ECOWAS scrambled to maintain control and foreign governments tightened their grip through economic pressure and media narratives, a different kind of transformation was unfolding within the Sahel Alliance. What had started as political defiance was evolving into a civilizational reset. In classrooms across Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, new textbooks were being written, not imported ones stamped by international agencies, but locally authored materials focused on indigenous history, regional trade systems, and African resistance movements. Statues once dedicated to colonial figures were removed and replaced by heroes of local struggles. Cultural centers were open to celebrate not just identity, but independence. These changes weren't mere symbolism. They were the soft infrastructure of a revolution. For decades, development in West Africa had been painted as something that arrived from outside, a gift, a loan, a reform package. But in the Sahel, that story was being rewritten. Now development meant roads built without IMF strings, clinics staffed by doctors trained in national programs, schools restructured not to meet foreign benchmarks, but to serve the needs of local communities. And at the center of it all stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, whose growing influence had shifted from political novelty to ideological compass. He wasn't promising paradise. He was promising participation. "We cannot fix everything today," he said in one address, "but we can stop outsourcing our dignity." Those words reverberated far beyond Burkina Faso. In parts of Ghana, Nigeria, and even coastal Senegal, young people began reposting his speeches, drawing parallels between their own stagnation and the Sahel's new path. Across Africa's digital space, a generational question began to rise. What if real independence was never granted, only delayed? And what if this was the moment to reclaim it? ECOWAS, still portraying itself as a guardian of regional order, was increasingly viewed as disconnected. Its calls for rapid transitions back to civilian governments rang hollow when measured against its silence toward entrenched leaders in other member states who had manipulated constitutions and crushed dissent. Citizens began noticing the double standards. Why was it that military regimes who prioritized basic services were punished, while democratically elected kleptocrats were praised? Why were free school lunches and armed village patrols considered undemocratic, but decades of corruption under the banner of elections seen as normal? These questions weren't born in think tanks. They rose from hungry stomachs, unlit classrooms, and unpaved roads. And no amount of diplomatic language could bury them. Meanwhile, the AES continued building. Construction expanded on cross-border highways and railway links, bypassing ECOWAS trade hubs. A pilot project for a Sahel central bank began in secrecy. Economists from across the continent were quietly invited to advise on a sovereign currency backed by resource revenues rather than Western reserves. The symbolism was profound. Currency had always been a tool of control, minted with foreign faces, backed by foreign banks, and circulated through foreign-built institutions. To issue their own was more than economic rebellion. It was narrative liberation. But with each step forward, the pushback grew. ECOWAS leaked reports warning of impending collapse, hoping to scare businesses and deter potential partners. Western NGOs issued statements about shrinking civil space and lack of democratic accountability. International media increasingly painted Traoré as a dangerous strongman. Yet inside the Sahel, none of it mattered. The people weren't reading press releases. They were reading progress. And they were remembering. Remembering how long they had waited for roads that reached their homes. Remembering how many times promises were made and never kept. Remembering how their sovereignty was always conditional, their leadership always temporary, their needs always postponed. And so, even as isolation mounted, morale held. Because for the first time in living memory, the future was being built with local hands. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. The louder the world shouted, the more the Sahel states listened to themselves. International pressure reached a crescendo. Embassies warned their nationals to avoid travel. Think tanks published dire forecasts predicting economic collapse, food shortages, and regional instability. Financial institutions quietly blacklisted Sahelian banks. Donors suspended aid packages. Contracts were withdrawn. Airspace restrictions were floated. But none of it broke the spine of the alliance. If anything, it hardened it. Because for too long, external pressure had been mistaken for protection. And now, with their backs against the wall, the AES leaders discovered something they had never truly possessed: popular trust. That trust was not based on rhetoric alone, but on action. In Niger, grain distribution networks previously controlled by foreign aid groups were now managed by local cooperatives, cutting waste and ensuring food reached remote communities. In Mali, new security zones reduced attacks by more than half, not because of foreign troops, but because of restructured patrol strategies and community intelligence cells. In Burkina Faso, once abandoned school buildings reopened with locally trained teachers paid by national mining revenues. These were small victories, but they mattered. Because for people who had grown accustomed to being forgotten, every win was a revolution. And as these stories multiplied, the Sahel identity began to change. No longer passive, no longer reactionary, it became assertive. Children learned the names of national heroes who had resisted colonization. Elders gathered to share stories not of despair, but of resilience. Radio hosts discussed economic sovereignty. Religious leaders began delivering sermons about justice, not just in the spiritual realm, but in the material one. The revolution wasn't just fought in parliament halls or on battlefields, it was being fought in minds. Meanwhile, ECOWAS faced its own reckoning. Internally divided, it struggled to present a unified front. Nigeria, the regional giant, was quietly distancing itself from military confrontation, burdened by inflation, political protests, and waning regional influence. Ghana's leadership, once vocal in condemning AES, now found itself overwhelmed by domestic criticism and hesitant to commit. Other members, aware of their own fragility, grew silent. The bloc that once projected power now projected uncertainty. And that uncertainty created a vacuum, a silence into which the Sahel's voice grew louder. International observers struggled to understand the emotional tide. They misread the defiance as mere nationalism. But it was deeper than that. It was generational grief, finally expressed. It was decades of stolen futures, bottled up and now uncorked. It was the child who grew up without a school finally walking into one. It was the grandmother who had waited 40 years for electricity finally switching on a light. It was real and no sanctions could erase it. Ibrahim Traoré understood this better than most. His speeches, though often fiery, always circled back to one thing: dignity, not just geopolitical sovereignty, but human dignity. The right to build, the right to defend, the right to exist without apology. In one of his most memorable lines, he said, "We were told we could not stand unless we begged, so we stood without asking." That line appeared on murals, school notebooks, even on handmade billboards outside village council halls. It became the heartbeat of a movement. Foreign media kept calling him controversial, but to millions he was necessary. Not flawless, not messianic, just necessary. Because he had done what others had feared. He had placed trust in his people before demanding it from abroad. And now the trust was being returned. The Sahel was no longer asking to be included. It was building something to be joined. And the longer it endured, the more the world had to reckon with a truth it had long refused to see. That Africa's future was no longer being written in foreign capitals. It was being drafted in dust, in heat, in defiance, and in hope, by Africans who had decided they would wait no more. As the Alliance of Sahel states solidified its foundations, its existence began doing something no military operation, no political summit, no development grant had ever done. It reshaped the emotional architecture of an entire region. It redefined what was possible, not just in policy, but in imagination. Across West Africa, people were no longer asking if sovereignty could work. They were asking why it had taken so long to be tried. The effects rippled far beyond the Sahel. In Ivory Coast, young activists staged silent marches with banners reading, "We are watching." In Guinea, university debates were held comparing ECOWAS's legitimacy to AES's urgency. Even in Nigeria, students launched podcasts analyzing Traoré's speeches, not as propaganda, but as case studies in leadership. What had begun as a rebellion had grown into a philosophy, a framework of thought where foreign approval was no longer the highest form of success. Instead, the new currency was internal strength. AES had begun rejecting the idea that African nations had to be measured by how closely they followed global expectations. Instead, they measured progress by what their people felt, saw, and held. Clinics, roads, clean water, functioning schools, these became the new criteria for legitimacy. And it wasn't just rhetoric. Burkina Faso announced the completion of a new maternal health center funded entirely through gold reserves. Mali expanded its farmer seed bank initiative without foreign technical support. Niger opened a civil service training college using a curriculum drafted by Sahelian educators. These moves didn't generate flashy headlines in global newspapers, but in the eyes of their citizens, they were revolutions. Meanwhile, ECOWAS's credibility crumbled further. Each new condemnation of AES sounded more like an echo than a warning. The bloc's calls for rapid return to democratic norms rang increasingly hollow in a region where leaders had rewritten constitutions for personal gain without ECOWAS lifting more than a finger. People remembered. They remembered how the bloc had tolerated third-term extensions, how it had ignored disputed elections, how it had turned a blind eye when elites enriched themselves while poverty deepened. And now that 3 states had broken the mold and declared independence of action, ECOWAS was panicking. Not because those states had failed, but because they hadn't. It was the success, not the struggle, that threatened the system. In global capitals, alarm bells rang louder. Analysts on televised panels questioned whether Africa was slipping away from the traditional partnerships. Some warned of a new scramble for Africa, this time led not by conquest but by competition, for influence, for minerals, for allegiance. But that framing missed the point. The Sahel wasn't being claimed by a rival superpower. It was being reclaimed by its people. It wasn't becoming the pawn of a new empire. It was finally walking off the chessboard. That shift terrified those who had grown comfortable navigating Africa through old frameworks, aid dependency, electoral diplomacy, debt leverage. Now, none of those tools seemed to work. The AES refused IMF packages. It didn't attend ECOWAS meetings. It hosted summits with countries often labeled as pariahs by the West, but treated with respect by the Sahel. And the people responded, because for the first time their nations were choosing based on their own needs, not foreign favor. Even the language changed. Development partner became trading partner. Donor support became sovereign investment. Transition timeline became people's timeline. This linguistic rebellion reflected a deeper truth. The AES didn't just want different policies. It wanted a different vocabulary for what it meant to be a nation. A vocabulary rooted not in extraction, but in equity. Not in surveillance, but in solidarity. Not in waiting, but in building. And while critics continued to point out imperfections, delays, budget constraints, security risks, the people themselves had already done the most radical thing they could. They had believed in themselves, in each other, in a new direction. And belief, once ignited, spreads faster than any campaign, deeper than any threat, and stronger than any sanction. The Sahel was no longer a region to be saved. It had become a region to be understood, and perhaps one day emulated. As the world watched, waiting for collapse, the alliance of Sahel states did something extraordinary. It endured, not because it was perfect, not because it was wealthy, but because it was willing to break the rules that had caged it for decades, willing to say no to institutions that claimed to help but often hindered, willing to try, fail, learn, and try again, not in the shadow of permission, but in the light of purpose. ECOWAS, once the proud enforcer of regional order, now faced a reckoning not just with policy, but with perception. Its silence during real crises, its alignment with distant capitals, and its heavy-handed response to Sahelian autonomy had exposed a truth long whispered in village gatherings and back-alley cafes, that perhaps the greatest threat to African sovereignty wasn't always foreign invaders, but African institutions serving foreign interests. And so, the AES didn't just reject ECOWAS, it outgrew it. In dusty towns where hope had once dried up, new seedlings were sprouting, not just of infrastructure, but of belief. A belief that roads built with national sweat were more valuable than promises made in donor meetings. A belief that sovereignty was not a slogan, but a system. A belief that freedom was not given, but taken, held, and defended. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at the center of this awakening, not as a flawless icon, but as a symbol of possibility. Young, driven, unapologetic, he didn't ask to be celebrated. He asked to be heard, and across Africa, he was. In his speeches, he rarely raised his voice, but he always raised the stakes. "We will not be remembered for how we complied," he said. "We will be remembered for how we stood." That sentence found its way onto the backs of motorcycle jackets, into the margins of student notebooks, onto murals painted by youth with nothing but brushes and dreams. Because in a region long defined by what it lacked, the AES had begun defining itself by what it would never lack again. The will to build its own roads, the will to protect its own people, the will to speak with its own voice, even when that voice was mocked or misquoted. This wasn't defiance for defiance's sake. It was survival through self-definition. It was the rediscovery of Africa's oldest truth, that unity is strength, but dignity is the source of all power. And yet, the threat still lingered. ECOWAS had not rescinded its warnings. The West had not abandoned its desire for influence. Sanctions remained. Smear campaigns persisted. The world was waiting for the Sahel to stumble. But perhaps the world had missed the most important detail. It already had, and it had gotten back up, stronger, more focused, and more unwilling than ever to go back to what it had escaped. As the final months of the year approached, AES leaders announced the next phase, a joint Sahel economic zone, shared customs, shared infrastructure, shared power. It was no longer just about military cooperation. It was about building a new system, one brick, one law, one principle at a time. And it wasn't only for themselves. They invited others to join, not as subjects, but as equals. This is not the future of Burkina Faso, Traoré said. This is the future of Africa, if Africa chooses it. That was the point. Choice, for the first time the region had a real one, not between one donor and another, but between dependency and dignity, between permission and purpose, between the past and something yet unnamed. What happens next remains unwritten. The road ahead will be difficult. Mistakes will be made. Enemies will multiply. But so will resolve. Because once a people stop asking for permission to exist, they start asking bigger questions. How far can we go, and who will come with us? The Sahel has asked, and now the world must answer.